Welcome to the second part of the reverb tutorial. The first one, we covered the 4-part reverb framework. Here we're going to dive a little bit more into detail and go over your questions, but let's start out reviewing. So we have the 4 reverbs. The first one is the tiled room. That's a short, bright reverb. Usually it can make something feel a little bit more exciting. Or it's just used for exciting sounds like the vocal or an open hat or something like that. And it also makes it sound a little bit more natural because we're putting it in a space. If there's no space on a sound, it sounds a little bit artificial. So this gives it a little bit more of a natural vibe. And then it also keeps sounds in the foreground. So that's awesome because we want to keep the sounds up front, but we also want to make them sound a little bit natural. And so this is perfect. And the second reverb, the wood room, that's a short, dark reverb. It makes something sound more full-bodied because we let a little bit more low mids through. Also makes sounds a little bit more natural. And this one pushes things a little bit further away from the front of the mix into the mid-ground of the mix. So if you need to position something a little bit further back. Next reverb is the plate reverb. That is a long, bright reverb, usually on exciting sounds like a lead vocal or just a lead synth or something like that. But it will push a sound way in the background, but still giving it like this nice metallic sheen. Or you can take a front of mix element and give it a background expression or tail using tricks like the pre-delay or sidechaining. And then the hall reverb, same kind of thing. It's just long and dark, giving a rich and deep character to the mix. Whatever you throw into it defines the back wall, defines the background of the mix. And again, you could push a sound way back deep into the mix or give a front of mix element a nice tail way back there in the mix. So that's the quick review. I also didn't mention this last time, I don't think explicitly, but the purpose of the reverb framework is to create a coherent natural space that lets you position any sound anywhere inside the 3 dimensions of the mix. That's really, really important when it comes to mixing. It creates a world that your sounds can live in. Okay, so let's just explore this idea of the 3 dimensions and how reverb plays a part in that. So the 3 dimensions of the mix, you have the frequency dimension or the spectral dimension, and that's just going to be up to down or top to bottom, right? So you have the low frequencies down here, you have mid frequencies and high frequencies. Then you have the stereo dimension, which is the left and the right speaker, but you have left, center, and right. And then you can also divide the stereo dimension into mid and side. Okay, the mid and sides. And then you have the depth dimension, which is front to back. And so level, just fader position alone will help you position a sound front to back because obviously if a sound is farther away from you, it's quieter. And so level will help you push something back, but reverb is a really sophisticated way of doing that as well. And just to oversimplify here, so oversimplification, we can think of reverb as your pan knob for the depth dimension. So just like with the pan knob, you can move things left to right. With the reverb, you can almost just move things from front to back. Now that is an oversimplification, but it's practically useful. So let me show you a visual representation of this. So we can think about where each of the 4 reverbs sits in the 3 dimensions. So here's a tiled room. We take a little bit of the low mids and lows out because we want a bright ambience, but we can see it's just barely away from the front of the mix, just pushed back just a little bit. And so that's the tiled room. Also, it's bright, so we're letting most of the top end come through. And then here we have a wooden room, and a wooden room is dark, so we're taking out some of the top end. It's also pushed further back in the mix behind the tiled room, and we're letting some of that full-bodied low mids come through as well, so it sits in just a different area of the 3 dimensions. And then we have a plate reverb, which is even further back. It's more towards the background, but it's a bright reverb again to get that sheen that just floats on top of the mix. And we're also taking out some of the lows here and the low mids just to give it that kind of top of the mix sheen. And then finally we have the hall, which defines the background. Now a hall is darker because if you think about it, a sound that's way far away from you, by the time the sound reaches your ear, most of the high frequencies are going to decay. So it sounds natural when you have just this long, darker reverb. And so that's what the hall is doing. Also, it gives that rich, deeper character because we're letting some of the more low mids through. And so this, I hope, is a helpful representation, visual representation of what the 4 reverbs in the framework are doing. And the key point is this, though. With level, EQ, pan, and reverb, you can place anything anywhere you want in the coherent natural space of your mix. Now, with level, EQ, and pan, you can put things basically anywhere, right? Because you can move things back by making them quieter. You can move things up or down with an EQ by taking out the lows or by taking out the highs. And then you can change their vertical positioning. And then with pan, you could just move things left or right. So you can really put things anywhere you want. But where reverb comes in is putting things in a coherent, natural space. That's really the difference maker here. This is where reverb takes all this positioning to the next level. And then, so it just boils down to listening to your imagination, positioning things where you want them to go, and trusting your vision. So with that, let's just go ahead and dive into some of the questions that we had based off the first tutorial so we can get a little bit more specific about all this reverb goodness. So the first question is, what about sending a sound to multiple reverbs? Now I have another little picture here for you. And this is, again, just a three-dimensional representation. Now, this is really cool, though, because, and I'm sorry for the jumbled numbers here, but if you think about it, we really divide all of the three dimensions of the mix into threes. So with the frequency dimension, we have low, mids, and highs. So here we have low, mids, and highs. And then with left to right, the stereo dimension, we have left, center, right. So 1, 2, 3. And then front to back, we can have foreground, midground, and background. And so all these little points here are just really nice reference points for the three dimensions of the mix and thinking about where things go in the three dimensions of the mix. So with that, so I hope this picture makes sense. It was the best one that I can find. I also made the front of the mix here, this square, a little bit darker just so we can get a better reference. But let's say we had a vocal. Okay, we're going to send it to multiple reverbs. But a vocal, the main expression of the vocal is going to be around 1 to 4K. That's where the meat of the vocal is going to cut through in the mix. So we're going to be sitting in the center because a vocal is going to be mono, recorded with one microphone, right? So we're sitting right here, kind of around 25, maybe just above it. And then let's say we throw that vocal into a tiled room. So immediately we're going to get a stereo dimension, but we're going to get a bright stereo dimension and ambience. So we're going to get pushed back just a little bit from the front of the mix. So automatically we have this extra, several extra dimensions added just by introducing that one reverb. And then let's say we wanted to throw it into a plate. Well, a plate is a bright reverb. We're taking out a lot of the lows and low mids, and it's going to get in the background of the mix. So back here. And so the vocal is going to take up a lot of space in the top half of this kind of mix cube here. And so that's a nice way of thinking about this. When you hear that a sound is taking up a lot of space in the mix, you can visualize it in this way because it really is, if you visualize it in this way, is taking up a lot of space in the world that you create. Now, not every sound needs to have that large of a presence. It makes sense for a vocal. You want to have that upfront drier vocal just to have that clarity. Then you want to have a nice natural ambience, maybe pushing it back a little bit. But then in the vocal gaps, you want to have you want the vocal to carry over and have that nice background expression. It sounds really natural. And you want it to take up a lot of space because it's really important. But let's say you have a percussion sound. That's not as important. It doesn't need to go into multiple spaces. Maybe you just want to park it over here by number 7 or something like that. So you're going to place it into the midground of the mix. So you'll use a wooden room, and we're going to come down here to 7 because we're taking away some of the top end. We don't need the top end from that percussion sound. So it'll come down here. Also, we're softening it with a wooden room. And then maybe we'll just pan it over to the left a little bit, getting it out of the center channel to make even more room for that vocal. Not every sound needs to be a hero, but some sounds do. And so using multiple reverbs is a great way to really just give a lot of space to an element, an important element like the vocal in a mix. And so let's dive in and just check out, for example, the lead vocal that we have in the demonstration. So we're setting it to a tiled room and to a hall reverb here. It's not right, but it's okay. Now, if I took out the hall, let's listen to what would happen there. It's not right, but it's okay. Just doesn't sound quite the same. It doesn't sound as natural. And if I took off the tiled room, now the vocal originally had a reverb on it, so we're going to get a little bit of that ambience, but let's check this out. It's not right, but it's okay. Now let's put the tiled room on. It's not right, but it's okay. So the demonstration here is to see that the tiled room really pushes it back in the mix a little bit. It gives it a nice, brighter ambience. It's not right, Really cool. And then together again.
It's not right, but it's okay.
Cool. And then in the mix, of course, that's where it matters. Let's get this back down to about 5, I think.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
And then if we turn the reverbs off.
It's not right, but it's okay.
Now this is key. Listen to how it just sounds separate from the space. It's not existing in the same space as everything else anymore.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
But as soon as we introduce the spatial elements, the reverbs, bam, it just gets right placed perfectly in the mix.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
So the vocal's just taking up that space up there, and hopefully this is a good visual representation for you of what's going on. Question number 2, what about using other reverb techniques? Now this is a great question, and to answer it properly, I need to kind of dive a little bit more into the purpose of the reverb framework. So the reverb framework is a flexible and highly customized space for the mix, right? Because it's flexible because we have 4 complementary spaces that unify, that work all together. And it's customized because if you remember from the first video, we set each of the reverb's parameters and the pre-reverb EQ. We set all those parameters based on number 1, the reverb's dimensional purpose, and number 2, other sounds in the mix. We made sure that when we were adjusting the reverb times and the tone, that we were doing it in the context of the mix, responding to the actual sounds in the mix. And then number 3, we also made sure that the reverbs worked together. So we soloed the rooms, made sure that the wooden room was being expressed and that it wasn't getting in the way of the tiled room. So maybe we filtered down a little bit more to let a little bit more of the brightness go towards the tiled room. So all the rooms work together as well. So the point is, any other space or reverb technique that you introduce, it's going to stand out. Now that can be a great thing, but that's obviously going to be a creative decision. And this tutorial is more looking at like the uses and the specifics of the reverb framework. But let's look at an example. In the comment section, we were talking about the Abbey Road technique. And so what I've done is I've created an Abbey Road little reverb here. And before we were talking in the comments, I actually never heard of the Abbey Road technique, but it's pretty much very similar to what we've been doing. And it's just using a pre-reverb EQ, a bracketing EQ, meaning that you're filtering out the lows and the highs just before a reverb, so going into a reverb. But the technique is a little bit more specific. You're taking out everything below 600 and 10K and anything above 10K. So that's kind of the basis of the Abbey Road technique, is the bracketing EQ into a reverb, taking out below 600 and above 10K. It's a great technique because it's taking out any mud that you might get and really just focusing on the nice mid-range, but also it's letting a little bit of sizzle through without letting anything that would make a reverb sound a little too artificial come through above 10K. Okay, so here I have the lead vocal, sending it to the AR send here, or return, and I've key mapped this so that we can switch back and forth between the 2 vocals. And so we can kind of hear the difference on what's going on. Now, of course, it's going to be relatively subtle, but the Abbey Road should stand out. It should feel like it's in a different space. So I'm going to start out playing the lead vocal once, and then we'll move into the Abbey Roads, and we'll switch back and forth like this, okay? So here we go.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
Cool. So I hope what you can hear is that the Abbey Road space is standing out, and it should, because we have not customized it to work with the elements in our track, really. Now, I did do a little bit, okay? I did remove a little bit of the mid-range here just to make a little bit more space and clarity for the actual vocal, but I haven't customized it really to the other sounds. I'm just strictly doing the 600 cut and 10K cut. Now, of course, you can go in there and fine-tune this to make it work, to have a new space, but I'm just keeping it simple here to show you that the space really stands out. And sometimes that will work. I don't think it quite works in this case specifically because the Abbey Road lets a little bit of top end through. And that's actually competing with the reverb I have on the open hat, which is the plate reverb. It's a bright reverb. So in this case, those are kind of competing and they're kind of incompatible to my ears. And another cool thing that we have with the lead vocal is that we have the bright ambience from the tiled room, but then the vocal reverb slides down into the hall reverb and just fits right underneath the hat. But that's the whole point of this, is to create these compatible spaces that all work together. And so check this out. Listen to how the vocal reverb is just sitting underneath the sheen of the plate reverb on the hat.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
Just that nice tail on the lead vocal from the hall sounds really good underneath the hat. Now, the point of this was to show you that the separate space will stand out, and it definitely stood out. But there's lots of ways to make something stand out, and putting it in a different space is one way to do it. Now, here's another idea. Maybe you want to create an entirely new contrasting space for a break section. Any contrast that you could use between the break and the drop is going to make for a more impactful transition. Now, maybe you don't want an impactful transition. Maybe you want it to be smooth. That's totally fine. But the option is there for you, and creating a new space is a great way to make a sound stand out in the mix, or to make an entire section of the song stand out in a mix and contrast with another section of the song. So really cool techniques there. Question number 3. Reverb sends, inserts, chains, when, how, and why. Short answers here. Sends. I use sends when I simply need to position a sound somewhere in the 3 dimensions of the mix. All right, so that's what the whole first video was about, is I just need to put this over here, and I could use a send simply to do that. Now, what about an insert? Well, when you want to get weird with something, right? So if you want to just automate a reverb, that's nothing new. You've probably seen that before, or verb something out, like just have something go off into oblivion, like in the break section, you can automate up the reverb on the drum bus or something like that. That's always a good thing. A great example of that, by the way, is Fisher's track crowd control. Even when you're listening into the intro, listen to how the drums are moving into a bigger and bigger space. And then when you get into the drop, it's a very, very dry drop. There's almost no reverb. It's a phenomenal example of contrasting sections using reverb.
Major Tom to
crowd control.
But another example is when I want to directly change the dry-wet balance of something. And we'll dive into that one. That one's kind of cool. And then finally, Ableton gives us another option where we can actually run effects in parallel on individual channels through the use of chains. Kind of like an internal send, depending on how you set it up. But I use this when I need to customize a space just a little bit more for a particular sound. So let's dive into a couple examples here. So I'm sure you've seen this before, so I'll run through this quickly. But let's say we have the drum bus, and we're just going to throw a reverb on it. I'm just going to copy the plate settings over here onto the drum bus. Of course, what you could do is just automate this up over time and just do some weird things. I mean, this is just going to be creative, right? So here we go.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
Right, just something like that. I mean, I'm going to let your imagination take you where you want to go with something like that. One of the things I like to use insert for is to directly change the dry-wet balance between a sound. So here's a new hat that I brought in. And here's the original hat. Obviously, you see they're going to work together. The new hat is just going to add some weight. And so together, those work really well together. Now, what I want to do, though, is I want to push this hat behind the first hat. That first hat is really the transient. I need the transient from that crisp top-end transient. So I want to push this hat behind that one. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just take the wood room here, and I'm just going to move it onto the hat. All I need to do then is just adjust the dry wet. Now, the reason why this works so well is that at the same time as I'm introducing the reverb signal, I'm turning down the dry signal. Okay, so this is kind of serving two functions. If I just sent this to a wooden room, all I'm doing is adding in wet signal. I'm not adjusting the dry signal at all. So this is a very quick way to simultaneously introduce a sound into a space, but also turn it down and push it away from the front of the mix, because that is exactly what I want to do here. And so all I need to do is just press up on my keyboard to move it in 10% increments, and we'll just find a nice spot for this where it's sitting behind the first hat. So right around here, 52, I got a little bit more detailed. Another thing we could do though is just take away the transient here. So if I just come over to the attack and maybe we'll take away 30 milliseconds or so. Maybe that's a little bit too much. Right around 20 seconds, milliseconds, I guess. All right, but if I take this away now, see how that's right in your face? Even when we're taking away the transient here to let this guy through, it still feels right in our face. But then as soon as I turn the reverb on, it pushes it back in the mix, which is exactly what I want to do. Also slightly turns the sound down. Cool, and then in the mix, it's going to be a little bit more subtle. That's why I wanted to show you in isolation. But let's just adjust these settings in the mix as well.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
And so you can use this technique also to just simply push back any sound that you need in the front of the mix. Just get it out of the front of the mix, and an insert's a great way to do that very quickly, especially if it's a secondary sound, right? So if you had like a background vocal, maybe just one background vocal or harmony, you could just quickly push it back by adjusting the dry-wet balance using a room reverb, because it'll push a little bit further back, especially the wood rooms. And then finally, when it comes to chains are the fun part. But for example, let me show you this. With the snare, right now it's being sent to the tiled room. So let's listen to the tiled room reverb by itself. Let's check this out.
It's not right, but it's okay.
Now, I don't like the low snare in there. And so what I want to do is I want to take that out a little bit. So we'll go ahead and try to find it.
It's not right, but it's okay.
So maybe that guy, we could just bring him down.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right.
Now, in this case, that sounds pretty good. We can get away with that. I like that.
It's not right, but it's okay.
But just in case that would gut a little too much out, let's say there was another sound maybe that had way too much mid-range for some reason, we had to really take that out because it sounded bad in the reverb, this would not be a good move because that would affect the other sounds coming into the return channel way too much. And so what I would do in the case where it was not working, I'll just use the snare as an example because we could still actually make it sound better. But what I'll do is I'll take this, I've grouped these two elements here, the EQ and the reverb, just Command G, and then I'm just going to drag and drop this onto the snare. And then here I'm going to open up the chains, and let's just create a new chain, and this will be the dry chain. And then of course this chain right here is the wet, and we'll just go ahead and switch them. And then finally I'm just going to drag this EQ onto the dry channel. And so we have a reverb now running in parallel with the dry signal on the snare channel. And what's great is that this is still a reverb that's inside of our space, but what I could do is customize the space just a little bit, or customize the sound of the space just a little bit for this particular sound. And what I wanted to do was remove those frequencies, the kind of low mid frequencies. So I'm going to remove the send here. I'm going to take away the send to the tiled room because now we have the tiled room just directly on the snare in chain form. So now I'm just going to take away that low mid area.
It's not right.
Let's go ahead and solo the snare. Okay, let's bring this down. And I'm going to solo the verb chain here. Maybe we'll just even filter up a little bit more. And so without this, right, so I wanted to take that out. I did not want that to be in the bright room. And so what I'm able to do is use chains to customize a space just a little bit more for a particular sound. And so now let's, it's going to be hard to tell, but it cleans up the mix just a little bit. And all these little moves just add up together to create just a cleaner mix, more space for other sound, more headroom so that you can really drive the track in mastering and just get things cleaner.
It's not right, but it's okay.
Question number 4, what about compressing reverb or limiting or saturation? So again, here are the quick answers to this. Compression, I prefer limiting. We'll dive into that. But otherwise, of course, sidechaining the reverb to different things. You don't have to only use the kick. Let's say that you want to use the vocal. So you use the vocal to trigger reverb on, let's say, the plate reverb, so that the plate reverb goes down in volume while the vocal is singing. And then in the vocal gaps, the plate reverb can come back and fill out that space. But you get that clarity by pushing that reverb down and letting the dry signal kind of dominate, I guess. And then when it comes to limiting, okay, there's no need to be gentle. Okay, when it comes to reverb, how silly is it to say, I love the transients on that reverb, right? Ridiculous. And so what I do is I like to just use a limiter and just pull that limiter down and just shave off the top or any peaks that are getting through in the reverb, because what's going to happen is that's going to allow a little bit more headroom, just a tiny bit of headroom, maybe a dB or two, to the sounds that actually need the transient expression or detail. And so I like to limit, just squash that down. You're not even going to be able to hear it. You don't want to hear it, okay? It's just there to serve a very technical function of creating just a little bit more headroom. So we'll dive into that. And then finally, when to use saturation? Well, saturation adds harmonic richness. It adds harmonic density. And so I like to use it to make bright reverbs brighter. And so we'll dive into that as well. And so for the first example, let's just check out the lead vocal and set up the sidechain compression on the hall. So compressor. Now I'm just going to do an infinite ratio. I'm going to set the sidechain to vocal, and we'll go ahead and turn down the threshold.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
Cool. And then so listen without it.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
You can hear that reverb swoop back in. And so you can control how the swoop happens, whether it's fast or kind of more gradual, using the release time. So this is moving pretty quickly back into the mix after the vocal is done. So 50 milliseconds, that's really quick. So you can just make that a little bit smoother if you wanted to just increase the release time.
It's not right, but it's okay.
So you can see that smoother move back, but check it out. If we move down to 50, it's going to be really quick.
It's not right, but it's okay.
Bam, right there. See, and then watch this.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right.
And so this is the compressed signal, turning the volume down, and then it moves back to zero gain reduction. All right, and so that's just one trick. Let's check it out in the mix. It makes the vocal a little bit clearer. Again, these are little things that will just increase the clarity when they add up. And so here, check this out.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
That is a great technique to use. Because man, does that vocal get clear when you turn this on. All right, so that's using compression just to sidechain to different elements. Of course, if you wanted to sidechain to the kick, that'd be a really cool effect, because reverbs aren't very loud, so you're not going to cause any problems if you don't sidechain your reverbs. But if you do, it's a creative thing, because then your entire mix will pump to the kick. But if you don't want your mix to bounce like that, of course, you don't have to trigger compression on the reverbs from the kick. It'll just make it really smooth. The reverbs will just kind of just sustain very nicely. All right, now limiting, the best part. So on this hall reverb, let's just go ahead and chuck on another compressor, and I'm just going to increase the ratio. I actually prefer using the compressor here as a limiter, and a limiter is just compression with a very high ratio, typically defined. A limiter starts when it's 10-to-1 compression. So every 10 dBs that go through, the compressor is going to turn it down to only let one through. So really heavy gain reduction there. But I'm turning it up to infinity. So anything that passes this threshold is not going to get turned up in volume at all. So it doesn't matter if we're going 6 dB up here. It's just going to output at the exact same volume, no matter what gets past the threshold. All right, so as that's what I want. I just want that brick wall. So I'm just going to turn this down. Let's go ahead and just listen to the hall. Could bring this back just a little bit. Again, we can control the decay time here. All right, and then on the plate reverb, what we're doing is just making a little bit more room for things. All right, and so let's go ahead and just bring this guy down as well, infinite ratio. See, we can get rid of that snare transient a little bit. We don't need that snare transient. We need the transient in the actual snare, not the reverb version of the snare. See, imperceptible, but it just opens up a little tiny bit more headroom for the things that matter. And so again, these tiny little things just add up over time.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
So when it comes to using saturation and make things brighter, let's grab a saturator. We'll also work into a compressor here, and we'll just set up the typical settings that we've been using, just pulling this guy down.
It's not right, but it's
Okay, just using that as a starting point. Now, with the saturator here, if we go through the different modes, we get increasingly harsher, okay? And so if I just kind of skip through these, we're going to get different sounds. Let's just try to find one that sounds good.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right,
So that's starting to get a little bit gritty. The soft sign's cool.
it's not right, but it's okay.
Maybe we could bring it down. It seems like it's giving it a little bit of level.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
Okay, so that's pretty cool.
It's not right, but it's okay.
Just bringing the drive back just a little bit.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not
We might as well throw in one more trick here. So if I come over to the lead vocal, this is going a little bit outside of the bounds of the tutorial, but let's just check this out. So if I figure out where the vocal sounds really good, let's see,
It's not right.
in the mix. So I'm just going to exaggerate it.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
So right around there, about 1.5.
It's not right.
Yeah, right around 1.5. Like I was saying, the meat of the vocal, really 1 to 4K, but really the nice tone, the present tone in the vocal is going to be right in the range of 1 to 2K specifically. So I'm going to go ahead and move this actually onto the tiled room. And then what I could do is change this to mid-side, and maybe we can clear a little bit of that space out in the mid channel just to make a little bit more room for the vocal.
It's not right.
So let's see what this would sound like.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not.
Just going to sweep around just a little bit more fine-tune.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay.
So that's pretty good. So I'm looking for a spot where when I take it out, it still sounds okay. And so that means that I don't really need that particular frequency. So let's just reset this and kind of drop it down so we get a natural kind of separation.
It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right.
So it's making it a little bit wider, but getting a little bit more room for the vocal.
It's not right, but it's okay.
Cool. So that sounds pretty good. So making it a little bit brighter, doing some minor adjustments there to make it sound even better. Question number 5, getting creative with reverbs, automating, bouncing. Might be showing you a couple things you might have seen, but maybe a slightly different take. One thing I want to do is get some kind of punctuating effect back over here. So one thing I want to do is see if we could just do a little clap bomb, okay? And just to get a little punctuation here at the end of the second bar. We do have the rims doing something a little bit different each time, so we're getting a variation every other bar kind of with the rims. But let's just kind of spice that up a little bit. So I'm going to duplicate this clap, and I'm just going to do a little clap bomb, which is just the clap going into a big reverb, basically. I'm going to go grab all the plate settings here, and we'll just go ahead and copy this over here. Next, what we'll do is I'm going to group the reverb so that we can automate a couple things with one macro. Let's go ahead and macro the dry wet. And I'm also going to macro the on-off switch. Okay, so let's change the mapping on this, and we need to change the on-off switch from 1 to 27, because that means when I come all the way down here on the macro to 0, then that means the plugin is going to be off, because what this macro is doing is saying that the on button is going to be on when the MIDI values are between 1 to 127, but there is a 0, and so when the MIDI value is 0, see, we could go all the way to 0, but we're going just to 1. When this knob is at 0, then the plugin is off, but as soon as we lift up and go anywhere from 1 to 27, then the reverb is going to be on. And so what I want to do is automate this down at the end so that it goes down and then shuts off. So to set that up, I'm just going to create a new automation lane here, and I'm just going to draw in some quick automation like this, and we'll go ahead and just go like this, and then turn all these guys off, and there we go, just something like this. Hear that? Just turns off real quick. Okay, now what I can do is just turn this up. So the compressor is going to keep it at a constant level, which is cool. You'll see there's a lot of gain reduction on there, but it just makes it go pop and just keeps it sustaining. And we can just use this basically as the fader. So in context, let's just check it out. And then another thing is with these chords, what we could do is we can have it swoop into this bar, and we have it swoop into this chord right here as well. So let's go ahead and duplicate the chords, and we'll go ahead and just bounce them. And then what I'm going to do is just take this guy, and we're going to put a reverb on him. Let's just take the hall. Let's take the hall reverb. Okay, so now that we've dropped the hall settings on here, this is what it sounds like. And then let's just go ahead and bounce it again, freeze and flatten. And then, of course, just go ahead and reverse it. So let's check this out. And we'll just go ahead and do a fade in. So Option Command F, and then bam. All right, so with a little bit of tweaking, it sounds pretty good. Just made the clap a little bit quieter here, and the reverse cymbal, and then we have the reverse chord, and I just put it right here. So all together. It's not right, but it's okay. It's not right, but it's okay. Cool. This just gives us some punctuation at the end, just letting us reset for the next cycle around. All right, and just a little bit of crash. Most of the things that we did though were only with reverb, and that's the whole point, is you can do so many crazy things with reverb. So I hope that was helpful, diving a little bit deeper into reverb. For me, it all starts with the framework. The framework is the starting point. You get a coherent, natural 3D space without going overboard. All right, and you can position any sound anywhere that you want, which is so key for mixing. And as this video showed, you can always get more detailed if you need to, with chains, with processing, with inserts, all that kind of stuff. Again, if needed though, right? It's all about the fundamentals, video 1, and if you need to go deeper, you can, but really you're set up for success. That's why I created the framework, for myself at least, just giving me that coherent 3D sound, and I hope it works for you as well. If you have any questions, leave them down in the comments. That's what this is all about. I want to see where you want me to take this. I probably won't make a follow-up to this anytime soon because I want to dive into other concepts as well. But leave some questions below. I'll answer them there. And if I do make a follow-up, then that will be what I go after. All right. Thanks so much for watching, and I look forward to your comments.